Okay, so let's see if we summarize some of what we spoke about. That our happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, but rather our happiness is to be found in our attitude to the flow of life. Just like our suffering is not actually found in the flow of life, our suffering is found or is created by our attitude to the flow of life. So obviously there have to be two attitudes. One attitude that creates suffering and one attitude which doesn't. So what is the attitude that we currently have to the flow of life that creates suffering? And that attitude we're calling the attitude of personal doership, which is based on the beliefs in personal doership. The beliefs in personal doership are twofold. One, I am the doer, and the other, that I am a separate entity in control of everything that happens through me. So I am the doer, and that the other is the same as me, a doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure. The attitude of non-doership is not actually a new belief system. It's just the absence of the attitude of doership. So when the attitude of doership dissolves, we don't end up with a new belief system. We actually end up functioning from our being and our true nature. And our true nature is peace. So actually the attitude of non-doership is the natural attitude of our heart. When we flow from being, which is just allowing ourselves to move based on what we feel like doing in that moment, we then find that our relationship to the other from that place is a relationship where we don't treat them as a competitor or as an enemy. And when something goes wrong, the blame doesn't come up, which means we can say, wow, my relationship to life is now an attitude of non-doership, which doesn't mean a mental belief system. It's just our natural way of relating to life, a way where there is no attachment to outcome. So in spirituality, with this word attachment to pleasure simply means the belief that I need that. And when attachment to pleasure falls away, there is still a biological preference for pleasure and a movement towards pleasure, but without the expectation that we will get it and without the need to get it. One of the things that happened very early on in the change that was happening for me is that I realized that I had a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts in place. And when I looked at it, the shoulds and shouldn'ts were there as a strategy to get pleasure, because I believed that I needed that pleasure to be happy. And so following the shoulds and shouldn'ts meant I was following a strategy and not doing what I really felt like, what the body was telling me. And so an example of that is that I would come home from a day at work, having made arrangements to meet someone for dinner or something, and I was really tired and I just wanted to lie on the couch. And I'd look at my watch and I'd say, I've only got 5 minutes before I need to go and have a shower. And then the 5 minutes is up, and all I wanted to do was keep lying on the couch. But instead, I had to go and have a shower, get ready to go out. And at some point I realized this is an internal conflict of having to do what I think I should do versus what I feel like doing, what the body is telling me to do. And it became very clear to me that what I actually want is the end of internal conflict. And so that meant when I became very clear that what I'm looking for is the end of internal conflict, that became my priority. And when that was the priority, I was able to then accept consequences as secondary. So if I had an appointment and I was tired and I didn't feel like going out, I decided, well, you're going to have to cancel. Whereas previously, cancelling wasn't an option, because my shoulds and shouldn'ts would say, you shouldn't cancel because you made a commitment. But that was just leading to an internal conflict. So once I became clear what I'm really looking for in life is the end of this internal conflict. And that got placed on a pedestal. And I became very clear that that is what I'm looking for. The end of internal conflict. Which meant I could then accept the consequence. Yes, it's true, I might cancel and my friend might not be my friend anymore. But that was okay, because that was secondary. It was only secondary because I became very clear about what was my priority. The good news is that I cancelled, and my friend said, oh, it's great, I'm so tired too. Let's do it another time. Oh, fantastic. Really good. So what we expect, what the mind thinks the outcome is going to be, is not always the case. A more extreme example of doing what I felt like was finding that when I had to wake up at 6 a.m. to go to work, to an alarm clock, or wake up to an alarm clock, that feeling of waking up when I wanted to stay asleep was another form of internal conflict. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone does this, but it was my journey. And so I said, that's it, it's internal conflict. So I unplugged my alarm clock. I'm not going to go to work until I wake up and I feel like going to work. And before I did this, I contemplated what this really meant, because it was pretty clear that if I stop going to work, I'm going to lose my job. If I lose my job, I'm not going to have money. If I don't have money, I'm not going to be able to have my apartment, etc., etc. And I really thought about it, and my priority was the end of internal conflict. So I said, how can I not go to work and still survive? And it became clear I won't be able to have my apartment. So I found a caravan, and I was going to live in the forest on social security. And I thought about it. How am I going to feel living in a caravan in the forest? I had this notion that my friends would come and visit, and they'd bring a bag of plums. I thought that'd be nice. Yeah, I'll have some, little garden outside the caravan. And I really imagined what this would be like. Day after day, no shower. Really, I'd have to go and walk from there to go to the shops, and then maybe go and visit some friends and have a shower at their house. And the whole thing seemed acceptable to me. So at one point, I decided, okay, that's it, unplug the alarm clock. And so I stopped going into work. And there was this system, this night system, that I worked as a financial advisor, a portfolio manager in the stock market. And there was a night system that allowed us to place orders and do the administrative stuff from home at night. And I started using it during the day. And it was a very simple system compared to what we had at work. But I was able to deal with some clients. And after 5 weeks, I went into work to get something from my desk. And my boss saw me and he said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Oh, I've been working from home." And he said, "Oh, okay, carry on." And I thought, and actually my business changed quite a lot because I couldn't deal with clients in the same way I used to. And what happened is some clients fell away and some others sort of grew because it was more along the lines of what they wanted, some personal service and what have you. And my business got bigger than it used to be. And I was working from home and working just a few hours a day because I only had 10 clients. And so another example of what I expected to happen. So I had the caravan that I never used. I had knives and forks and everything in the caravan. It was ready. It was basically ready to put on the back of a car and take out to the forest. but it didn't happen. And so, this is an example that when we take a leap of faith, when we really feel this is what I need to do, that life tends to support us, because it's life that's bringing about this urge to do things differently. So doing what you feel like doing, and this isn't for everyone, because if people have strong addictions in place, and I say, do what you feel like doing, it's not necessarily what I mean, but it could be, because if you do it without guilt, you might be doing it for the first time ever without guilt, because addiction tends to actually come from an underlying problem, often guilt. And then when we're doing it, we feel guilty doing it before we've even done it. And so one suggestion is surrender to what you feel like, even if it's coming from an addiction. But if you are surrendering to doing exactly what you feel like, it means you've become conscious of that feeling. And if you do something consciously, without guilt, it may not remain in the same cycle that it has done, because something's changed. And when we do it, we'll see the consequences, because we're still conscious, we're still entering into this movement consciously. So you might have a sex addiction, let's say, and find that you engage with someone, and then afterwards there's a whole lot of hassle that you'd rather not have, because you've got different ideas of what you want. Whereas sometimes we just see the pleasure that we're getting, and then we don't realize the full consequence of what this addiction or this action is leading to. And if we're doing it consciously, we can see, yes, you get some pleasure, but then there's pain and a bit more pain. And when you see the whole thing together, actually, this is not worth it. It doesn't make sense. It's not delivering me what I think it's delivering. So experiment with these things. Don't necessarily do what you feel like with the biggest of things in your life right up. You can just start with some of the small shoulds and shouldn'ts, and change some things, and see how dropping away from doing what you've been told you should do by society or by parents or by yourself, because you believe that you need to act a certain way. Just experiment with little tiny shifts, and what we'll probably find is that there's a lot more freedom comes into our life. So as we realize there's some freedom, then we can start taking bigger risks. And then they don't necessarily look like risks at that point. They look like obvious steps I want to make. I don't want to keep doing things based on shoulds and shouldn'ts, because that's keeping me in my head and out of my body. So as we drop into the body and start feeling what we should do, we get closer to the place where we can find ourselves. We never find ourselves in our head. We only find ourselves in the heart, which is not the physical heart, but in the body. That's where the connection to source is. That's where the sense of existence exists. And when we connect to that sense of existence, then there's meaning to life. When we're running around in our head, that's where we feel disconnected, and where we feel dependent, and where meaning seems to not exist. So, anyone got any questions? Where's the...
Sometimes when I'm in the front of a really, really cold ocean, I don't at all feel an urge to go swimming.
Mhm.
I don't think I ever felt an urge. I feel like going swimming, but when I do, when I force myself to do it, I have never regretted it. It's always a very joyful, positive thing, and it's funny. It's so consistent, the feeling of not wanting to get out, and the joyous feeling of being there. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I'll change the example a little bit. I spoke about this with Dennis today, actually. Yeah. And Dennis was talking about, we were talking about exercising. And exercising is a bit the same. You don't feel like exercising sometimes, but often after you've done it, you feel so much better. And my suggestion is this: if you don't feel like doing it, don't do it. And then someone will say, but if I don't do it, then I'm missing out on the benefit of it. But how about if we do this? You don't do it, and then you start feeling that your mind isn't very clear, and that gets a bit stronger and stronger, the lack of clarity. And then one day you wake up and you say, I feel like going to the gym because my mind isn't very clear. Then you can go to the gym because you feel like going to the gym. And that way you've not done what you don't want on the day that you didn't want to do it. And then on another day, you wake up saying, I want to go to the gym, and you go to the gym. And a habit, a pattern changes. A slight pattern is that when you meditate, for example, and you've got a meditation practice, someone who does a practice will practice because it's 6 a.m, so that's when they start. And they might say, yeah, well, I feel so much better after meditating. But there's an issue to me in the principle of doing something habitually, because we're not following this flow. And so this doesn't have to be, because your example is a good one, that you feel good after doing it. And that information can combine with the fact you don't feel like it, but overall you do feel like it, because you know it's going to make you feel good. So if overall there's a part of you that says, it's so cold this morning, I don't want to go swimming. But if we focus on that, we might think we don't want to do it. But the part of you that says, but I love the effect afterwards, if you notice they actually coexist, the combined feeling might be, I want to go swimming. So if that's the case, go swimming, because you want to, even though there's a part of you that says it's so cold. But if there's no part of you that really says, I want to, in totality today, I suggest you don't do it. And then I think that what will happen is you'll find that the urge to go will pop up somewhere else. That's the same with your shopping. If you go shopping on a Thursday night every night, and shopping time comes and you don't feel like doing it, don't do it. Just try it. And then the fridge will get empty. And then one morning you'll wake up and there'll be no food in the fridge. And you go, I want to go shopping now. And then go shopping. And that it doesn't mean it will remain like that forever. There'll be a shift from a habit of doing something on a particular time because that's the time you do it, to this new movement of waiting to feel when you want to do it. And I think you'll be surprised at how efficiently things still work out. And then from that place, if something doesn't get done, you go, well, it wasn't meant to get done. But what I'm saying is not really specific to your example. I think you need to work that one out. Work out yourself.
I think my example was also kind of an illustration of like things that you can take it to exercise or even to work. Like
But the things that you have been told you need to do, then they're the ones that we should challenge. You know, your father has said you need to get a good job that is going to give you financial stability into your old age. And you find yourself working a job for 30 years that you don't like because you're following some advice that someone else has given you about how you should live life. At some point you go, I don't like this job. Why am I doing it? I'm doing it because someone has told me this is how I should live. They're the things that are worth really changing. And it takes bravery to do that, but sometimes it's not even bravery. When we really realize what the effect is, it's like, I'm stopping. I want to stop.
So is it on? Yeah. So it sounds to me that it takes a lot of choice to actually follow the predetermined way that you are laid, that is behind, in front of you. So it's like the leaf can fall, but if you don't listen to yourself, you will be on the wrong path. Or how do you?
So often we think that choice equals control. But that's because of our definition of choice. So thank you for the question. It's a great question. It needs to be addressed. Because we're so convinced that we are the doer, a lot of language implies doership in it. So choice implies my choice. Whereas actually when you look at what choice is in the absence of a doer, choice is something that happens. So if there are 10 options, let's say you're at a restaurant and there's a menu, there are 10 options on the menu. And based on who we are at that point in time, which includes our biological preferences, we'll look at the options. And at some point, one option is going to stand out. And when we choose that option, that's choice. But it's not necessarily my choice, but rather a choice based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which life put in place. Or the other way is, if we don't want to look at cause and effect explanation, we just say that that choice was a choice according to God's will, or according to the destined story of life. So that is choice. So even though life is totally predetermined from the beginning of time to the end of time, how life unfolds is through each of us making many choices through the day. And those choices are also part of the predetermined story of life. So a choice that we make at a particular point in time is the choice that we were always going to make at that point in time in order for life to unfold the way it does. So given that life is completely predetermined, how do I live my life? This is what Ramesh would say. It's a very valid question. And the answer he would give, in any moment, do exactly what you feel like doing, knowing that what you do is what you are destined to have done. Knowing that when you do something, the outcome is not in your control. Therefore, do what you feel like doing, sit back, relax, with no regrets in the past, no expectations in the future, and no complaints in the present. And that's actually a description of living life happily. Because no regrets in the past means no suffering of regret, of blame to the other for what they did in the past, no guilt about what you did in the past. No expectation in the future means not believing that you're in control and not needing expectations in the future because you no longer believe that your happiness is dependent on pleasure. No complaints in the moment because you know that complaining is just another form of suffering and it's not going to change anything. So that basically means a life of acceptance and living in the present moment.
Thank you.
So you mentioned earlier that when there's a choice, we can investigate if this choice was actually mine or how it was mine.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that investigation? How to investigate on a choice that feels really like a choice that I took?
Yep.
And maybe also, first.
So you're asking that based on last year's talks, or
you mentioned it? You mentioned it a little, just in one sentence here
Right.
tonight. But of course, it's from. I met you last year, and I had some experiences there, and I've been investigating what you told since.
See, these are great questions because the teaching gets to be unraveled this way, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about what Ramesh would say again. He said, we're not the doer, so there's nothing to do. No practice that you need to do in order for liberation or freedom to happen. Actually, it's a surrender, a surrender of doing the practice. If there's a practice that's being done strictly, it's usually being done strictly because we think it's going to deliver an outcome. So there's an attachment to the outcome and there's a sense of control. And so a surrender to doing your practice is actually a dissolving of that sense of personal doership. He did say, however, if you're going to do a practice because your personality likes having something to do, then do this practice. Once a day, at the end of the day, find a quiet place. And the practice is called a personal investigation of your own. Turn the phone off, close the door. And Ramesh was very pragmatic. He wasn't, he was a banker for his career. He said, if you feel like having a beer or a sherry, have a beer or a sherry. This is not some practice that you have to do in a special posture or anything. He said, and then pick an action that you are convinced was your action during the day. A whole lot of other actions you're not sure of, but this one you're convinced is your action. And then investigate it. And when you investigate it, you'll find that you did, or what happened because you saw something, smelt something, tasted something, touched something. What you saw wasn't in your control of seeing. You saw something and a reaction happened. A reaction happened and an action happened. And every time we investigate this, we'll find that what we thought was my action was actually a consequence of something that came before it that we had no control over. Either seeing something, hearing something, tasting something, touching something. So we're all here tonight. That's self-evident. And we say, this was my choice to come tonight. The investigation would say, yes, it was my choice, but I turned on Facebook and an invitation was there. And I didn't control that invitation being there. So I saw something that wasn't in my control. And then based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which also wasn't in your control, you resonated with it or you didn't resonate with it. You clicked not interested or going. And then on the day, all of life conspired to allow you to do what you wanted to do. Whereas it could have very easily ended up being that you had a stomach ache, or that the lift that was going to take you here didn't turn up. A whole lot of things that meant that you might not have ended up doing what you wanted. And this might sound trivial, but when we get down to it, we'll find time and time again that everything we do unfolds this way, based on a stimulus in life that we had no control over, a reaction from that stimulus based on who we are, and who we are is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we had no control over, and then an outcome happens. And an outcome is either going to be in line with our expectation, or in line with what we had chosen, or out of line with what we had chosen. So we can see that in theory, when we make a choice, it's based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we had no control over. And in practice, we make that choice and the outcome is not in our control. So both in theory and in practice, we're not in control.
So around 10 years ago, I was presented for a concept that when something happens to me, I react immediately, but I have the ability or the possibility to create a space between what happens to me and the reaction I choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, it was really a freeing concept for me.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this talk about this kind of space that you can create, and it can be bigger and it can be more free. And so how do you see that concept, or how do you react to that concept?
So at some point 10 years ago, life introduced some new conditioning. The concept that you could take 10 deep breaths before making having a reaction. So that was life introducing new conditioning, which wasn't something you were in control of. It happened. And as a result of that new conditioning coming in, you then related to decisions or to situations in a new way. And the new way was in line with your now up-to-date conditioning that life brought in. So that didn't actually make you any more in control. It just means that there's now, Johannes is now programmed to react differently than he did in the past. It's still a reaction. The reaction is now a reaction of taking 3 deep breaths. And so that's not you being any more controlled, it's just new conditioning. And conditioning is not a bad thing. We often think that it's conditioning that keeps us away from freedom. Whereas, remind me to talk a little bit more about conditioning. And why it's a positive thing is because in those 3 breaths, you're able to prevent a habitual aggressive reaction, let's say, or you're not preventing it, but the 3 breaths are breaking a habitual reaction, which after the 3 breaths is not as compulsively needing to happen as it might have been without the 3 breaths. And so the outcome of that conditioning is positive. But the principle is that life has conditioned you, and because it's or has reconditioned you, and then the outcome is different, but the principle is the same. That's not that you're not now in control. Does that make sense? Yeah. So why conditioning is not a problem, whereas in spirituality we often think that conditioning is the problem. It's good to introduce the notion of the working mind and the thinking mind. The working mind is the part of the mind that acts pragmatically. and decides how much money to take to the shop, what time to leave to get to the airport on time. And none of that thinking creates suffering. We often think or hear that freedom is the end of thinking, and somehow we're waiting for this magic moment where we no longer think anymore, which is just a false idea. Thinking is never going to stop, because thinking is needed in order for life to continue to unfold. What can stop is a specific type of thinking, the type of thinking which exists in what we can call the thinking mind. So the working mind will continue to function. The thinking mind is the part of the mind that is based on the belief in personal doership. So once the beliefs in personal doership dissolves, the thinking mind aspect stops. So the suffering of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation stop, because they no longer have a foundation on which to happen. Whereas the working mind continues. The working mind is based on conditioning also. So we learned how to do mathematics, we learned how to write, we learned how to speak. All of that's conditioning. We learned how to walk, that's conditioning. We learned how to hold a knife and fork, that's conditioning. We learned how to do economics. Everything that we've learned is conditioning. Conditioning is not a problem. Conditioning is great, actually. If we were unconditioned, we'd be immobile. We'd be a biological instrument that has no programming. So the idea that conditioning is bad is not that accurate. It's the conditioning that life has put in place that makes us believe that we are a separate entity in control of everything we do, and the conditioning that says that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, and that I should do this and I shouldn't do that. All of that is conditioning that is out of line with our true nature. And that conditioning falls away. What is being shared here is simply new conditioning. And this new conditioning can attack the conditioning of the thinking mind. And how it attacks it is by creating an opposite concept to what is embedded in the thinking mind. And as that opposite concept enters the working mind then investigates these concepts for itself, decides whether they're valid or not. And once it decides, yes, they are accurate and valid, then the working mind concepts, these concepts in the working mind, which is new conditioning, starts to attack the thinking mind when it pops up. So when the thinking mind goes into blame, the working mind says, hey, blame is based on the idea of personal doership, and I've spent long enough looking at the fact that personal doership is based on the idea that someone's in control and is ignoring the fact that someone acts the way they are designed to act based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, both of which were not in mine or anyone else's control. And so the working mind then cuts off the thinking mind. And so conditioning actually is the way that suffering ends.
Childhood is a lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts. I work in education and I am a mother, and that is something that I think about a lot. Not to give children the shoulds and shouldn'ts, but still be able to, because the conditioning is about being socialized or being with other people. And what are your thoughts about what we do with our children?
Yeah, well, the shoulds and shouldn'ts come because parents, I'm not saying parents, me if I was a parent, well, maybe not, as we come to see things differently. the shoulds and shouldn'ts are there in order to try and bring about what we want, the pleasures that we want, because we're attached to pleasure, and so we come up with strategies to get the pleasure we want. And so allowing our kids to function without shoulds and shouldn'ts might not deliver the pleasure that we want as parents. So really what we're doing is manipulating people around us in order to get what we want. And we do that habitually because we believe that having that is our happiness. So if we can start to relate to children differently, doesn't mean that we're now going to have chaos in the house. What we need to recognize is how can we do things differently. And I believe that if we give autonomy to children, teach them how to make decisions, that things can change radically. So if we said to a child, you're now going to start making decisions about your life in this family. So let's educate you as to how to make decisions that are good decisions. And I think that you'd find that children that are given autonomy to choose certain things like what time they go to bed won't abuse that privilege if they are given guidelines of how to make good decisions. In fact, you'll find a child that once they're given guidelines, not instructions, not this is the decision you need to make, but these are the considerations that you need to take into consideration when you're making the decision. Children, if they're not rebelling against someone, will actually want to please you. And they'll want to feel like they're making good decisions.
It's maybe sometimes a problem because they want to please you so much as a parent.
Yes, because especially if they think that their happiness is to be found in pleasure, love, effectively. So the deepest attachment to pleasure we have is the attachment to love. And sometimes we don't see love as pleasure because we're so used to seeing so many things in life that are pleasure as something much more than pleasure. But love is pleasure, and it's the pleasure that we are most attached to. So if you can teach a child that, you know, I love you, I'm your mother, and I'm your parent, and the more that we exchange love, the more that you can say, these are some of the things that I really appreciate and some of the things I don't appreciate. And then the child might find that they start considering what you appreciate and actually want to give you what you appreciate, but not necessarily from a place of craving love from you, from a natural place of wanting to see their mother happy. And that means that we have to educate children about what happiness really is, and dissolve this sense of personal doership, or at least not allow it to develop as easily as it does in society as it currently stands. So the amazing thing is that if we start living from a place of freedom, we can then act as examples for others, and especially for children, and start to encourage them and give them information that is not coming from our old way of fear, and which is the only way we can give them information if that's how we are. So a transformation in ourself is actually the best contribution we can give to society and our children.
going back to something you talked about some 20 minutes ago about meditation or having a spiritual practice, interested me a lot because I've thought a lot about this thing that various teachers, they instruct their students or whatever to meditate 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes at night, and it always struck me as it really makes me depressed, kind of, to think that some person tells me that I have to do something or it's for my own good to sit and be still and be quiet if I want to be rambunctious and run around. And but then they also sometimes say that, well, if you don't do this, your life will just continue on as it has been going so far and stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I suggest to everyone, do what you feel like. And at the same time as do what you feel like, understand that something like meditation can be helpful to quieten your mind, let's say, can be helpful to allow us to see things that aren't as easily seen when all of the visual objects are there. And so then we understand the benefits of meditation, but we don't have a rule as to when we need to do it. And knowing that there are benefits then allows us to engage in it when we feel like it, and we will feel like it once we know there are benefits to it. We'll feel like it once the issues that it can help with get strong enough and make life unpleasant enough. That's when we will choose to do the activity. And to me, I don't think I ever had any practice because it wasn't in my nature to feel like I had to do anything. And yet I found meditation would happen from time to time when I felt like it. And so there again comes this trust in life, that when I just surrender and do what I feel like, what is needed will happen. Having said that, I'm talking to a group of people who are here because they, found the invitation interesting. I don't think that this particular I know this particular teaching is not appropriate for society en masse, because the sense of personal doership is so strong in a lot of people that do what you feel like is going to come, is then meaning that people are going to be following addictions, they're going to be following a desire for pleasure, which means they'll start stealing maybe, and all sorts of things. So there's a trust that people here are here for a reason, and they're ready to hear these sort of teachings. These are teachings actually that were locked away in history because they're teachings that come and are valid for a ripe and mature person. And if they're heard by people who aren't ready, they will be used as excuses and justifications. And if that happens, that's part of life, it's destiny as well, and no one's done anything wrong. It was destined for that to happen. It was destined for the teaching to be there and for someone who is going to misuse it, but the misusing is part of the story of life, their destiny. And so that's going to happen. But by and large, there's a trust that the right people will hear this. And there's plenty of other spiritual teachings out there that tell people, this is how you should act. In Christianity, there's the 10 Commandments. In Buddhism, there's the 16,000 precepts, or at least the Eightfold Path of right thinking and right action and right vocation, etc. And those teachings are designed because it's known that there are a lot of people that are not ready to be told, do what you feel like, but actually need to be told, do this and don't do that. So if you feel like you're one that doesn't resonate with doing what you're told, but rather doing what you feel like, know that there's no danger in doing what you feel like when it comes to spiritual growth. It's actually it's a movement from doing what you're told to doing what you feel like, which follows the ripening of spiritual seeking.
You wanted to be reminded about conditioning?
Oh, I came back to that. Yeah. Thank you. I was just pointing out that conditioning is not all bad. Yeah. Free will, God's will versus free will, are they opposites? And the answer is no. Everything is completely predetermined, absolutely, completely predetermined, yet we have total free will to do exactly what we feel like in the moment. And what that means is we have to redefine our definition of what free will is. Free will basically means that in this moment, from a pragmatic point of view, from an experiential point of view, you feel free to do what you like. You can remain sitting, you can stand up, you can stand on your head if you like. That's your free will in this moment. And it's a gift. It's the sense of free will. If the sense of free will wasn't there, we'd feel like we are slaves or puppets on the end of a string. And so free will refers to this feeling in the moment that I am free to do what I like, with a deeper understanding that my free will in both theory and practice is worthless at controlling outcomes. But nonetheless, in the moment, I'm totally free to do whatever I like, knowing that that free will or your choice is a choice based on a whole lot of factors that you are not in control of. And that way we can see that God's will and free will are not saying different things. They're complementary. But what free will doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that I am a separate entity with complete volition and complete control over what I do and what the outcomes are. And if you don't quite get what I'm saying, don't worry, because I had to argue with Ramesh for weeks to actually realize what he was saying. And what he meant is that we can't just take one side of the coin and look at the theory and say everything is predetermined, or everything I do is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I didn't have control over, and so therefore I have absolutely no free will. Which on that side of the coin, it's true. You come to that and say, everything is totally out of my control, so therefore I have no free will. Then he said, but what about the fact that you're sitting here and you feel like you can do whatever you want? What should we call that? Why don't we call it free will? But it's not free will that's in opposition with God's will. And the reason is, if we don't take note of what is available in practice, which seems like free will, this sense that I can do what I want, then we go around saying, well, I have no free will, and miss this very crucial point that in practice, even though everything is God's will, we don't feel like we're slaves.
So I think you said something like our free will is absolutely useless in controlling outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking of a situation. Maybe I'm unemployed. I don't earn any money, and I'm starting to not have money to buy food. So I decide, okay, I can decide to just lie here and be depressed, or I can go out and look for a job and apply and maybe go study something. So I feel like I'm exercising my free will to go and get a job. And I can also do that without being attached to the outcome. Like maybe that's what's going to be happening. Life is bringing that I don't have a job now. But, like there's a lot of things that I can do where I can at least influence outcomes, it feels like, at least. So when it says absolutely worthless, that feels like a too strong formulation for me, because like, even though if you say life is this avalanche, like my actions do seem to influence the avalanche somehow.
Yeah. So what it means by absolutely worthless means that you're not absolutely in control of the outcome. So maybe we can drop the absolutely worthless bit. What it means is that your free will, which is your ability to make a choice in the moment, doesn't extend to your ability to control the outcome. So you have the ability to apply for a job, but you don't know whether you're going to get it or not. You have the ability to go to the interview of a job that you've applied to and you've received an interview, but you might get hit by a car on the way there. You might break your leg, you might, all sorts of things. That's what we tend to neglect when we're looking at life, is we neglect the fact that at any point in time we can be spun in a different direction to the one that we intended on when we left the house. And so similarly, when we look at a tossing of a coin, you toss a coin and you call heads or tails, and you call heads and heads comes up. So you got what you want, but was that because you were in control, or because it just happened to give you what you wanted? And so the story of life is a story that is written in such a way that you sometimes get what you want, you sometimes don't get what you want, and Ramesh would say, and sometimes you get much better than what you want. Which means that we have to recognize that when we set out wanting something and we get it, that doesn't mean that we were in control, because we have to recognize the times when we don't get what we want, or the times when we get much better than what we want. And that recognition then means we stop getting deluded about thinking we're in control on the 70% of the time or 50% of the time that we get what we want, because now we're realizing that in each moment we do something and the outcome could be any of these different options. So this doesn't mean don't live life doing the best you can, because what you've just described is use your free will to do the best you can, to do whatever you feel like, and that's the best you can do. So if someone hears these concepts and goes, oh well, then there's nothing for me to do, that's not an accurate interpretation of what's being said. Yeah. And then there's a question here next.
I was just curious if you would, keeping in that, where do you find that manifestation wraps in into that, what you just talked about?
The spiritual path of manifesting.
Yeah, ish.
So, I don't have an issue with all spiritual paths. They all serve a purpose, and all that's being shared here, none of this is the truth. There's only one truth in the manifestation, and that's the impersonal sense of existence. That's the one thing that doesn't change and is true, is this sense of being that we all have inside that we're very rarely in touch with until we start recognizing it's there, and eventually that's all that's important, the sense of being. Everything that's shared here is just concept. It's not truth. It's pointing actually at the truth of who we are. And so if we look at teachings that way, then we know that teachings are going to approach things from different angles. And teachings are going to be targeted at people that need specific instruction or guidance. And manifesting is something that can bring people to see life as a more mysterious unfolding. But what it can also do is it can strengthen the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure. Because manifesting is, you have the power to manifest whatever you want. And people go, this is great because my happiness is dependent on pleasure. And now I've found an answer to getting the happiness I think I need through pleasure. And so what it does at some point is reinforce a false belief about who we are and what we need. And it also means that if someone doesn't get what they are trying to manifest, which is always going to happen in life, you're not going to get what you want all the time, they now believe, well, I'm just not manifesting well enough. And in a year's time, once I've perfected this technique, then I'll be able to get everything I want, which is another way of not seeing the nature of life. The fact is, the nature of life is that everyone has their destiny, and within their destiny, the amount of pleasure and pain that we're going to receive in life is determined. And it's never going to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. It's always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain. And so I think the spiritual path of manifesting is something that is appealing to people at a certain point in time and can be very helpful, but at some point we need to realize, wow, this is just solidifying certain false beliefs that need to eventually dissolve. And I just see life as happening, not something that I control, far from it. I know I don't control it, but if I surrender to life, I don't need to control it, because my happiness now is not dependent on things turning out a certain way. Yeah. Oh, you've got it already.
We talked about it during the break, but something else just dawned on me, so I'm just gonna... So we talked about the thing that I've experienced through the last half a year, something that I've let go and I've surrendered, and that things actually turn out okay, and my attitudes and my choices are really changing from what I was used to doing. But I've had a lot of problems changing my attitude towards what I would call old shit. And it's been really frustrating for me, because I really can't change it. And so it just dawned on me now that I have this great expectation to myself that I need to forgive. I need to forgive others, which in your words would be blame, and I need to forgive myself, which would be guilt. And you had this about meditation, so maybe I don't feel like forgiving. Is that even an option? Because I think it's like when you get spiritual enlightenment, you get this notion that you have to forgive and just let go. And
well, actually, you get something beyond that, is the realization there's nothing to forgive. The idea of forgiving is that someone did something wrong and they could have done it differently, but I'll overlook it. I'll forgive it. And the realization is no one ever did anything. There isn't anyone to have done anything. The sense of personal, these pointers to the end of the notion of personal doership actually dissolve the belief that there is any one here. At the end of non-dual seekings, the realization is that you and I don't really exist, except in the experience. And then there's a realization there's nothing that needs to be forgiven. But even if we don't go as far as saying that we don't exist, the notion that whatever happened was always going to happen that way, and there wasn't anyone that could have done it differently. And more so that my happiness wasn't taken away by that action. It was only my belief system that meant that that outcome was treated as though it was an attack on who I am. Then when that changes in us, then our relationship to what happened in the past changes. Which I know doesn't make it less painful. If you want to talk about one of the things that you find hard to forgive, we can do that.
I think that's too personal. Thank you.
Okay.
When you say God's will, I very much relate to what you say, because you have just established what you mean by it with the non-dual and so on. It's not a personal God. For me, I think it's that word God is very much established in our culture as a personal being. So I was wondering why you chose to use that word. Like, you obviously consider it maybe like, because initially, like my initial reaction is that using that word has a bigger chance to be misunderstood, because it already has another meaning, a personal creator.
Yeah.
So yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I use the word consciousness and source a lot, and I realized that there wasn't a connection to the words consciousness and source. And when I started using God's will, which actually Ramesh used to use, there was a connection to it. People actually, the notion of God, you're right, it's loaded. And so on the one hand, if you talk about God and someone has an issue with God because of the type of God that was in their life in the past, a God that is a personal God that punishes and all of that, then it can be misunderstood. But I actually found that it creates a resonance, because somewhere inside of us, and ultimately, even though when there's a realization that there is no God, that once freedom is there, ironically what is there, there's a whole lot of gratitude to something. And when we look at it, even though we're not separate from, we're connected to Source, we still find that there is a gratitude from Roger to Source or God. And so the paradox is, even though we come to see that there is no Roger separate from God, there is still a personal relationship to God. even with a complete understanding of non-duality, it's just the way that this manifestation unfolds with a personal relationship to God. Not as a God that we visualize, but just a relationship to something greater than what Roger is. Because even though Roger is not separate from Source, Roger doesn't have God qualities. Roger doesn't have the capacity to control, to create, to be omniscient. And so the way that this manifestation is created, although I'm not separate from God and no one is separate from God, I'm not God, but I am God. And so because I'm not God, there is a relationship with God of gratitude. And deep down inside, I think the word God actually inspires love. So once again, you make a very good point, and I don't disagree with you. But I came back to using God's will because I think it creates a connection. And so if someone has an issue with God, then we can use the word source or consciousness. Because they're just words. So, yeah. Anyone who has an issue with God, source or consciousness. Yeah.
Me neither. I just wonder, why would you use a word that's kind of, in my mind, already meaning something else? It could be Odin.
Odin. Oh yeah.
Anything. I mean, but yeah.
That's very Scandinavian, I think. But yeah, which is very appropriate. Yeah. No, and the funny thing is, I held your opinion totally, which is why I was using source or consciousness, and realized that something was missing, and changed back to God and saw, oh wow, there's a difference here. So I can't disagree with you because I started off very much from that standpoint.
But but as you said, you connected, like the final feeling you get to was gratitude, and that's what you connect the word God to. So
yeah,
as I understand you, yeah, okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah. I think I probably move. A couple more questions, but I think we're coming towards the end. Are we? I guess people are getting tired. I'm not, but I have this strange ability to keep talking about this stuff. So.
That's a free word. Okay, so if things are kind of predefined by the source,
kind of,
then karma doesn't exist.
Yeah, karma as personal karma is an extension of the idea of sin and personal doership. Karma still exists, but it's a completely redefined thing. So karma really means cause and effect. And there's no doubt that in this life, if you're a thief, which you're forced to be, it's your destiny. Destiny is also such that when you get caught, you'll get put in prison. Not because you are fundamentally a terrible person, but because there's a consequence to a cause. And so karma really means cause, effect, which is the nature of life. Life is all cause and effect on the surface anyway. Ultimately, there is no cause and effect. Ultimately, everything is spontaneous. But this spontaneous creation of life is designed to unfold as if it is a linear story in time based on cause and effect. And so karma just means that change and cause and effect.
Okay.
Not personal.
Then I have another question. It seems like spiritual development is something people see, I mean, at least in spiritual circles, as some kind of higher being or something. I've always been kind of against that because, like, if we are all one, we all have the same energy, and if things are pretty predefined, then, I mean, we don't decide who is, like, more close to the source or who is not.
Exactly.
So I mean, you can't say that one is better than the other.
Precisely, I agree. Totally, 100%. So, some saint, if someone's a saint, they're a saint because the source determined that they would be saintly, not because of their superiority. And if someone is a rapist or a murderer, that's happening because that's their destiny in life. And unfortunately, the destiny of whoever's affected by that. And so this story of life is not fair. It's a creation that for many people is very unfair. You see people that have lives full of suffering and commit suicide. And that's sad. So saying that everything is predetermined doesn't mean that we become devoid of emotion and don't appreciate the fact that destiny can be very tough on people. You just look at people with disability, people in war zones, people that have been abused. This is very sad. It doesn't take away from the sadness of it. But it can be understood from the perspective that this life is a story of duality, which means if there is good, there will be bad. If there is health, there will be disease. If there's wealth, there will be poverty. And so anything that happens in life can be understood as part of a story of duality. It's a bit like a movie of a certain genre. This is a movie of duality. And so once we start seeing life that way, we stop asking, why did this happen? Because we understand why, because it's a story of duality. And so whatever, even the terrorist attacks, fit into a story of duality. There is kindness, and then there will be evil, or evil acts. And it doesn't make it nice, but it makes it understandable as part of the story of duality.
Thank you.
I can ask tomorrow also because I come tomorrow. So if you want to close down the...
I don't mind, but I just don't want people to feel.
Okay, so I'll ask the question. How do you look at emotions, feelings? Like we tend to have some feelings that we believe is good feelings, and then we have some feelings that we believe are more unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you look at what is the function of unpleasant feelings as sadness, for example, or anger or something like that?
So it's very important to bring in the notion of biological reactions versus psychological reaction. Biological reactions are something that won't dissolve with change in attitude. They're part of our biological makeup. And psychological reactions will change as our belief systems change. So sadness and anger, when it's just sadness and anger on their own, are biological reactions. So even without an attachment to pleasure, if someone that I love dies, there will be sadness, not because I feel part of me has been ripped out, but because something that I love is no longer there, and so sadness can arise. But deep down below that, my peace of mind is not affected. And similarly, if I'm walking near the edge of a cliff, and suddenly someone comes past, rushing past and pushing, and I see that there's a physical danger, I can get angry in order to react to that situation. So it's a biological response. Now, both sadness and anger in their biological form don't include blame or grief. So even if I say, hey, look out, and push, someone would say, oh, you're blaming him. I say, I'm not blaming him. That's a biological reaction, because if I didn't do that, I could end up 50 meters down there. And they said, well, you're not accepting the fact that he's pushing. I said, damn right, I'm not accepting pushing. So the acceptance is on an attitudinal level, not on a biological level. It means that I understand that behavior was destined to happen, and it's my destiny to react to that biologically. But once it's finished, I'm not thinking, why did he do that? He shouldn't have done that. It's over. In the moment, clearly biologically, I'm saying you shouldn't be doing this when I'm so close to the edge. But after that, it's cut, it's finished. Whereas blame is something that happens with anger when there's the sense of personal doership. So we get angry, and then we have a whole story on top of that. A story that they shouldn't have done that. And so sometimes someone does something and we have a story for the next 10 years about it. Instead of it being a reaction in the moment of anger, and then it's finished. Once we know the difference between the biological reactions and psychological reactions, and we see that both biological and psychological are there because of our makeup, our biological makeup, and our psychological makeup. So if psychological reactions happen of guilt or blame, we shouldn't feel guilty about the fact that that's happening. If we recognize that the psychological reaction of guilt is a result of the beliefs of personal doership being in place. If the beliefs of personal doership are in place, then we know guilt has to happen. We have no control over that. And we weren't in control of the beliefs of personal doership being in place, and we're not in control of when they finally get released. So to the extent that a psychological reaction happens of guilt or blame or pride or expectation, we don't need to resist it. We don't need to say it shouldn't be like this. We just need to understand that it's a consequence of some conditioning that life has put in place, and therefore it has to be there until such time as life undoes that conditioning. And then the psychological reactions will fall away. So I don't have a judgment over emotions. They're understandable based on what they are and where they come from.
And they seem to have a function, right? The anger part is defending you in the situation.
Yeah.
Fear could be waking up. You hear some sound in the darkness, and you have to be aware. What is that? Because it could be dangerous.
Yeah, sure.
Sadness. What is the function of that?
Sadness is a function of appreciation. So if you've had wonderful love in your life, the sadness is the appreciation of the love that you've been gifted in life. So in real sadness, the core of it is love. It's not grief. Grief is very different to sadness. Grief is where we feel like part of who I am is now ripped out and there's no hope. Whereas sadness is a peace at the bottom and an appreciation for this gift of love that lasted for 1 year or 20 years without needing it to have been a minute longer than it was.
So in the moment when I feel sadness, I'm aware that it has this quality of appreciation, but does it have a natural reaction? That's like fear has a reaction of waking up. If somebody tells me what you did to me made me feel sad, Okay, I know that it's not me who did it, and I know that the other person's blah blah, but I still feel the sadness. And then I'm curious on what is the natural reaction on that. I don't know if that.
Yeah. So if someone gets angry with me for something that I did, exactly as you said, I know that my intention wasn't to hurt them, and yet clearly, even though my intention wasn't to hurt them, they might have been hurt by what I did. And I'm sad that someone that I love has been hurt, especially by my actions. And so the function could be to generate an apology, which I'm very happy to do, even though I know it was predetermined and I had no control. It doesn't mean that I can't in this moment say, I'm really sorry for what happened. It doesn't, saying I'm really sorry for what happened doesn't imply I feel guilty. Because I know I apologize very freely, without feeling deep down that it could have been different. So maybe that's a function of sadness.